Hi, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. Do feel free to keep your videos switched on, but as with for any of you who have joined us before, and I can see plenty of you who are returning, which is always a nice thing to see. Please do keep your mics on mute so that there's as little audio distractions as possible. So welcome to you all this evening. Once again, we find ourselves in the midst of another wave of the corona, the corona issues. I hope you're all keeping safe and well. And on behalf of us, the Zionist Federation and the World Zionist Organization, welcome to you all. This evening we have a very esteemed speaker. He's actually an Anglo-Israeli who made Aliyah in the, correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, but in the late 90s. Our speaker this evening is Mike Prashker. Now, Mike Prashker is the founder of an organization called Merchavim, and Merchavim is the Institute the Institute for the Advancement of Shared Citizenship in Israel. Now, he founded that in 1998, and just a couple of months ago, we hosted Merchavim, and during that Zoom, they showcased their program, which seeks to integrate Arab teachers into Israeli schools. And for those of you who had joined us back then, I think you'll all agree that it was a very fascinating and insightful event. We had some wonderful speakers, two wonderful Israeli Arab ladies. I think one of them self-identified as an Arab Palestinian. But what was clear from that is that Israel's non-Jewish citizens have a wide variety of how they identify. And all of those should be respected at all times. So this evening's webinar is all about Israel and its epic journey of society building since its inception in 1948, much of which has been done and continues to be done against great odds. The title, as you know, of this evening's webinar is The State of Israel, Better Than Expected, Less Than Required. And in there's obviously the message that, yes, it's a glass half full. And what we've, for those of you who are familiar with Zionist history and the history of 1948 and the Declaration of Independence, there was a paragraph in there, as read out by David Ben-Gurion on the 14th of May, 1948, where it says, we extend our hand, sorry, actually, I stand corrected. It's the previous paragraph. We appeal in the very midst of the onslaught launched against us now for months to the Arab inhabitants of the State of Israel to preserve peace and participate in the upbuilding of the state on the basis of full and equal citizenship and due representation in all of its provisional and permanent institutions. Now, for many of us who advocate for Israel on a daily basis, we are quite rightly proud of the fact that there is freedom and equality in Israel, but at a society level there are issues, and that's what Mike is here to discuss this evening. Mike is also, in addition to being the founder of Merchavim, he is also an author and has authored a book all about this very subject. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Mike and give him the floor. So Mike, there you go. Welcome.
Hi, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for that introduction, Steve. I actually moved to Israel in 1978. I'm sure long before you were born, I imagine. So,
right.
In fact, looking at the screen, long before most of you were born, but nevertheless, moving forward. So thank you so much for inviting me. And what I'm going to do is I've decided, as Steve has suggested, Steve and I, as you would expect, discussed it, and I'm going to speak for about 35 or 40 minutes. hopefully that will be somewhat engaging, and then we'll have time for a conversation. And I think, Steve, what you asked for is that if there's any questions, they should go in the chat to you. Is that what you prefer?
That's correct. So yes, well, I'll invite questions in the chat session as you go through. Thanks, Mike.
Okay, brilliant. So thank you very much. So the talk, my talk tonight is called Israel Better Than Expected, Less Than Required. Social cohesion, which is, as Steve mentioned, is the concept that I spend my time working on and writing about, and the future of Israel, which is what we all spend our time worrying about and working for. So I'm just, maybe, let me just put it on slideshow, be better. There we go. And so I'm going to start off by saying something about myself. As Steve said, I grew up in London. I grew up in Stanmore, and I moved to Israel after my A-levels, which was over 40 years ago now. And this is actually taken from the cover of my book. And seeing I only intend to write one book, I, as you can imagine, gave it quite a lot of thought. And it's a sculpture, actually, that I had done by a friend, a very good friend who is an Arab Israeli sculptor, Nihad David, who lives in Ramleh, which some of you might know. It's a town very near Ben Gurion Airport. And we had a conversation about the kind of image that I wanted on the cover of my book. And it expresses myself as a proud, confident, Jewish Zionist, somebody who believes passionately about Israel as the national homeland of the Jewish people, and somebody who is, thank goodness, has seen the country grow in strength over the decades. So it's strong. It's strong, but it's not perfect, and there's still work to be done. And we had a fascinating, over coffee, we had a conversation, Nihad and I, about how the name of the book, Israel is going to be a place for us all, and how the cover of my book will be welcoming for citizens of Israel of all backgrounds and everybody who cares about Israel and loves Israel. And actually the book is published in a single volume in Hebrew, Arabic and English, which is the languages of most of those who are either citizens of Israel or as you are, invested in Israel. And so we had a conversation about putting in some of green and some red, and making Nihad, as an Arab citizen of Israel, feel that he had a place in Israel's future. So I would describe myself overall as a critical Jewish Zionist, somebody passionately committed to Israel as national homeland of the Jewish people, somebody who wants Israel exactly as Steve referenced in the Proclamation of Independence, in the Declaration, ever fairer to all its citizens, and of course, God willing and neighbors willing, living in accommodation in the region, in peaceful accommodation in the region. So I'm going to this evening speak about who are Israel's 9 million citizens, and the concept of social cohesion and what I mean by that and how it can be usefully used, and also where Israel is in the kind of spectrum of society building. We're all struggling, of course, so where is Israel in a comparative context? I then want to just say a few words about some of the big things happening in Israel over the past 18 months, in the shadow of COVID, of course. And then some of the key insights moving forward, what I think we all need to be focused on. So that's basically what I'm going to do. So who are Israel's 9 million citizens? Very quickly, and I apologize for those of you who are probably teaching Israel studies in UK universities and know this at least as well as I. But of course, 80% of Israel's 9 million citizens are Jewish. That, by the way, is a figure that has remained pretty much constant from day one, from Israel's founding, with less than 500,000 citizens in 1948. Many of the Jews, of course, come from North Africa and Arab countries, about 20% from the former Soviet Union, Ethiopian Jews, about 150,000. Israel's Arab citizens are at around 20%. Actually, they're about 16% citizens and 4% in East Jerusalem are permanent residents. They are overwhelmingly Sunni Muslims, and there are small Druze and Christian communities. President Rivlin, who of course was president before our current, also wonderful president, President Herzog, made a speech in 2015, which really raised the bar on, I would call it the beginning of Israel focusing on society building. He kind of said, as I do, we've had decades of very successful state building, but now we have to thicken the fabric of Israeli society. He identified 4 tribes making up Israeli society. Of course, all societies are far more complex. They can be divided by gender or sexual orientation or by age or ethnicity. He talked about, he used Israel's 4 separate school streams, he therefore said about 15% of first graders are knitted kippot, national religious, 25% of young Israelis Arab, and 25% of first graders ultra-Orthodox, Haredim, and Jewish secular. He later added, by the way, because there were lots of compliments, but some people said, well, Israel is national homeland of the Jewish people. Where are world Jewry? Where are 50% of the world's Jews who are not citizens of Israel? And he added reference to a 5th tribe, which broadly speaking is you. So how are all these Israelis feeling in 2021? And have been feeling, I think, for a long time. And that is that they mostly feel misunderstood and unappreciated. Each of the communities that I've mentioned feels in one way or the other hard done by. I think everybody would agree, whether one agrees with the politics of many of the national religious community or not, but completely irrespective, that community has been in the forefront over recent decades of shaping Israeli society. They are overrepresented in the army. They're highly represented in government and in public service. They're working really hard. And of course, the project of the settlements, which is identified broadly as a national religious project, has been driven with huge ideological energies. And from the perspective of that community, huge sacrifice. So what that community feels itself misconstrued and unappreciated. Arab citizens of Israel, until very recently, when the first time that Arabs have really been in a government, but they've been on the periphery since 1948. When generally people say Israelis, or too often, when we say Israelis, we mean Jews. And of course, that's like saying British and meaning Christian or meaning white. Israelis are not all Jews, 20% of them are Arabs. So they felt transparent and vulnerable, and the historical discrimination is a matter of fact acknowledged, by the way, by Israeli governments, successive governments. And I can say that Benjamin Netanyahu's government did more than any previous government to close those gaps, and the current government is doing even more than that. But the work being done to close those gaps comes from an acknowledgement of historical discrimination. The ultra-Orthodox community regards itself, of course, with some justification, as rebuilders of Jewish learning after the catastrophe of the Holocaust. Those who have built um, large institutions, rebuilt Jewish learning, and carry out the tasks around kashrut and chevra kadisha and all of the tasks that other Jewish Israelis really outsource to them. And so why are we perceived as lazy and even worse by some Jewish Israelis? And of course, the last tribe to reference President Rivlin, this is the tribe that, with some justification, with a great deal of justification, feels that it built the state, and the early pioneers, and of course the Mapai Party, the Labour Party, were overwhelmingly Eastern European secular Jews, built the state. So if we did so much, how can it be that there's now so much resentment? So all of the groups really, in one way or the other, feel a little bit misunderstood and unappreciated. Israelis also feel fragile in their identity, and I've actually been involved in some research on this. And when you ask, it would be very interesting to ask, who feels British in the UK? But when you ask Israelis of different backgrounds how Israeli they feel, they generally feel that a real Israeli is someone else. If they're religious, they think it's secular. If they're Arab, a Jew. If they're black, white. If they live in the geographical periphery, it's someone in the center. So you've actually got quite a lot of insecure people walking around in this very strong country, feeling that real Israelis are somebody else. I've been meeting Israelis of all backgrounds for 30 years to do the work that I do, which is strengthening the fabric of Israeli society. And I always say, I'm yet to meet an Israeli of any tribe who perceives themselves or can imagine themselves as posing any kind of threat to any other Israeli. On the other hand, I've never met an Israeli who doesn't perceive some other tribe as some kind of threat to their identity and their way of life. So you've really got a country of 9 million people in which nobody thinks they're in any way frightening to anybody else, and everyone is threatened by the others. So obviously this is a big challenge. So my work is about strengthening social cohesion. That, of course, is a big issue around the world. It's a big issue in the UK. It's something I talk to colleagues about in the UK, in the United States, of course, in Europe. We're all struggling to build better shared futures and improve intergroup relations. And like any serious conversation, we need to start off by understanding what we mean. So let me just share what some people mean by social cohesion and what I mean by it. A very large German foundation in a large piece of research in 2013, when it defined social cohesion, it talked about three things. It talked about the relations between citizens of different backgrounds, connectedness, the relations of those citizens to the state, how much they feel at home, how much they trust state institutions. And they spoke about a common good. When citizens of a country think about the future and a better future, do they agree about what that might look like? The OECD, in a large report in 2012, talked about three lenses. It talked about social inclusion. So this is similar. It's not a world of difference, but there are nuances. They spoke about social inclusion, and that directly goes to, for example, when one says Israeli, is that me or is that someone else? They spoke about social capital. Social capital is a term from sociology, and really it means trust. It's about intergroup trust. And the third, which is of course a big issue here in the UK, I know, and around the world, is social mobility. And that is where you start life and what are your chances of climbing up the ladder. I went about it when I wrote the book that Steve mentioned, and I defined social cohesion in a rather different way. The characteristics of relations among all of a state's citizens which provide them with the best prospects for a successful shared future. Okay? So there's a couple of things there that are, I think, important for this conversation. One of them, and this is not unique to me, it's the Bertelsmann Foundation, the OECD, others who speak about the concept of social cohesion. Social cohesion has to do with how citizens of a country live together. You can have unity, please God, in the Jewish people. You can have camaraderie in a place of work. But what I'm suggesting, and others are suggesting, that we talk about, we use the term social cohesion to talk about relations between citizens, not within a tribe or a people or a religious community or a place of work. And the second thing, which is really critical, is it's about all of a state's citizens, that you can't cherry pick with whom you want to be cohesive. You can't say, for example, we're going to have a cohesive Britain, but that's not going to include a particular religious or ethnic community. You can't say we're going to have a cohesive Israel and say, but that's not going to include Bedouin or ultra-Orthodox or any other community. It's a package deal. We're in this together. You know, that image of a ship, we're in this together as citizens, and citizenship matters. So where is Israel now in international measures of social cohesion? So the Bertelsmann Foundation, which I mentioned before, it compared 34 countries in the European Union and other Western developed countries. And this was a major, important study, and they placed Israel 28th out of 34 in the overall standing on social cohesion. And what they mean by that, again, they mean intergroup relations, trust, relationship with the state, and a sense of a common good, common shared future. On a particular measure in which they looked at attitudes to those who are different, attitudes to diversity, Israel came out 33rd out of 34. Okay, just to show you at the bottom there, because I can never remember, here you can see the countries that are ranked at the top and the countries that are ranked at the bottom. And I'll say a little bit more about why they're where they are in a moment. What I do want to say, though, is just talking about the 33rd out of 34. Obviously, that's not great. And my work is to move Israel up that measure. But it is important to note that in this entire study, there was no correlation found between social cohesion and the actual diversity of a society. So one can't say because, for example, the UK has become more diverse because there's more immigrants, or the United States or Israel, that it's by definition going to be less cohesive. It's not about the makeup of the society, it's about the attitudes. So that is good news in that, of course, that can change. Attitudes can change. But having given you that kind of, in a sense, glum picture, I'm going to give you my assessment, which might well surprise you. And that is that Israel is doing better than expected, but less well than required even given that data. So let me just explain why this is my strong conviction. First of all, in 1948, if anyone had said to any of us, thinking ahead 74 years, that Israel in 2013 is going to be included in a measure of 34 democracies, the European Union and Western developed countries. Does that sound good? Is that realistic? I think most people would have said, well, that would be absolutely tremendous. To get into that club is an achievement in and of itself. So I think, first of all, we have to take a deep breath and say, 75 years ago, being part of this survey would have been highly surprising. And when we look at the history, when we look at the trauma that all communities experienced in Israel's birth, when, of course, we look at the pre-birth, the catastrophe of the Holocaust, and then, of course, the catastrophe, as Palestinians call it, of their catastrophe, the establishment of the State of Israel, the exile, the immigration, often forced immigration of Jews from North Africa and Arab countries. When one looks at the history, I absolutely believe that Israel is doing better than expected. But of course, it's less than required. Does none of us want Israel to be 28th on medical technology or performance when it comes to the pandemic, or high tech, or the economy, or agriculture, or any one of 100 areas in which Israel is overperforming? Obviously, it makes complete sense to want Israel to do better. So my perspective is that looking at the history, for example, just democracy, of course, Israel is I'm going to argue, still an immature democracy and a democracy in progress. Well, all democracies are a democracy in progress. But we have to remember, in 1948, in the first Knesset, there were already 3 Arab members of the Knesset. Israel's institutions, democratic institutions, were built so robustly that they've stood the battering that they received up until today. And there's some aren't. And of course, achievements along the way that should not be dismissed. Israeli women got the vote 20 years before Swiss women. All of this matters a great deal. So, and the title of the talk, Israel Better Than Expected, Less Than Required, lots of work to do. So what are the challenges to building more cohesive societies, societies with the conditions that allow everybody to fulfill their potential and create a better shared future? Well, a lot of the challenges are really global challenges, and we're all kind of, you know, on the same planet and in the same boat. Population growth, density of population, movement of population, of course, populism, alternative facts, the confusion between facts, opinions, and feelings, pessimism, and of course, the pandemic. All of those, Israel really has on steroids, except I would say the pandemic, where until now we've done rather better than the UK and some other countries. But the population growth has been much higher than global averages. The population density here is very high. Movement, of course, unprecedented immigration, and like many other Western democracies dealing with populism pessimism that is a close relation of that populism. But there are also distinct Israeli challenges, and I use the word distinct as opposed to unique, because different countries have challenges that are not dissimilar. The establishment I've spoken about. Profound disagreements that really play out frequently over who's in charge in a profound sense. Orthodox religious soldiers, who are they going to take orders from when push comes to shove, from their officers or from their rabbis? That's a big issue, and it's very much a live issue in Israel, but again, not only in Israel. In the United States, of course, are they going to teach evolution or creationism? You know, so the United States actually has quite a lot of that as well. Ongoing conflict. The ongoing conflict is corrosive. It's wonderful that our Prime Minister has just come back from a visit to the UAE. It's an enormous breakthrough. I'm extremely excited about the Abraham Accords, but the conflict is very real with 5 million Palestinians who are in the West Bank and Gaza. Keep in mind that 2 million of Israel's citizens are Arabs with a strong sense of Palestinian identity, feel part of the Palestinian people. And so the conflict is corrosive and it cannot be set aside. And it has, among other things, meant that Israelis have very separate lives, not only Jews and Arabs, but also religious and secular. And separation, of course, breeds fear. Related to what I've just said now, the border issue, states in kind of basic definitions in first year political science, states have agreed borders. In Israel's case, the citizens don't agree, the neighbors don't agree, and the international community doesn't agree. That all matters. I want to just take a moment longer on Israel's definition as national homeland for the Jewish people as a challenge. And many of you will have been aware of the nation state law, which goes to exactly to this issue. My position has been, I argue it in the book, and I will continue to argue it, that as national homeland to the Jewish people, Israel can be and must be ever fairer to all its citizens. And that's to do, that's based on looking around the world and seeing that there isn't actually a necessary connection between the definition of a state and how fair it is to different groups of citizens. For example, the United States is a state for all citizens. Nobody would say it's fair to American citizens of color or indigenous Americans. The UK is an Anglican state, but it's been, and I'm a son of this privilege, it's been extremely fair historically to the Jewish minority, which is ostensibly excluded from the symbols of the state. And in fact, sociologists will say that the most disadvantaged groups in the UK are Anglicans in, sake of the conversation, working class Anglicans in the geographical and social peripheries. So there is no necessary connection between Israel being the national homeland for the Jewish people and it being unfair and always being unfair. It's completely legitimate definition of statehood. What is not legitimate is not to do work every day from morning of night to ensure that a country is ever fairer to all its citizens. And it's obviously true that when a state has a particular definition and symbols, there's a sense of entitlement among that group. So we have to work really hard for Jewish Israelis to understand that just because they're Jewish and just because Israel is national homeland of the Jewish people, that doesn't mean they get a preferential treatment on everything. And by the way, I'm glad to say the progress is enormous. Today, when I look around the country, the chairman of Israel's largest bank, an Arab citizen of Israel, a third of students in Israel's MIT, the Technion, Arab students. We're making progress, but that requires a great deal of work. Again, we need to feel connected. Being a citizen is not something that is only a hugely important, the most important political identity in the modern world. Okay, but it needs to be more than a legal status. It needs, we need to make a building a home, a house a home. One of the challenges to this progress is the kind of Leon Uris myths that we all grew up on. And that is that Israel was once a perfect democracy. Israel was a democratic miracle. I don't think, I think it's surprising, given the circumstances of Israel's birth and the fact that pretty much none of the citizens had any democratic background whatsoever. I think it's really quite amazing that Israel was established as a democracy. There are different reasons or hypotheses of how that happened. But Israel was a one-party democracy for 30 years. And one-party democracies are not terribly democratic. So Israel was not a perfect democracy. Now, what I'm also confident of is that Israel, and I include the huge challenge of the conflict and occupation and everything that goes with it, and that's what I call it because that's what it is by international law. Not that Israel, and only Israel is responsible for it, but this is the reality on the ground. But Israel today, in many senses, is more democratic than it's ever been, and I want to justify Israel's diverse communities, Arab, ultra-Orthodox, national religious, immigrants, LGBT, every community, women, have made enormous progress in this country over the past 30 years, driven a good deal by civil society, by through very hard work. And today we have a situation, and it plays out also in the Knesset today, where unprecedented numbers of citizens of Israel of all backgrounds are asserting their right and commitment to a place around the top table, to first-class citizenship. And that is really, really good news. And so that is something that is happening. The other myth that makes things really quite hard, because it's quite depressing, and pessimism is completely useless for society building, is this myth that Israelis once got on, that we were all dancing around the campfire, having a lovely time. Keep in mind that there were no roads, no telephones when I came to Israel. Different tribes were plonked down wherever they were plonked down, in Bnei Brak, in Dimona and Yerucham. Arabs who remained in Israel after 48 were in isolated communities. Israelis didn't meet each other. It's only now, as everyone asserts first-class citizenship, that we're actually in contact. And it's only when you're in contact with other tribes that you have to learn to live with them. So Israel was never a cohesive society. Harmony is not cohesion. There are different conditions, whether it's the UK, the United States, anywhere else, there are different conditions that I believe are extremely important to creating the possibility of better shared futures. and I'm just going to run through them because I don't want to speak for more than a few more minutes. A mature democratic culture as opposed to adolescent. Institutions are hugely important, but democracy is fundamentally about values grounded on pluralism. It's about the ability to accommodate disagreements. It's about really behaving like grown-ups and not having it all my way or the highway. So a mature democracy is critical for a strong social fabric. States aren't islands. Citizens need sustainable relationships with other communities that impact the way those citizens live together. When there is fighting between Israel and Gaza, when there is a round of regional conflicts, that inevitably has implications for relations between Israel's Jewish and Arab citizens. And of course, half of the world's Jews are not Israeli citizens. Israel is national homeland for the Jewish people. What Israel does or doesn't do, what Israel's relationships are with world Jewry matters for Israeli society. Borders I've mentioned. Critically, and this really goes a long way to explaining why some countries were doing really well on social cohesion and some much less well. But it's only one explanation. There is a clear correlation in endless research between levels of social cohesion and economic gaps. When economic gaps are extremely large, as they are in Israel, it is very, very hard to create cohesive societies. There are barriers that are simply too great to be brushed aside. So the countries doing best are not only richer countries, but they're richer countries that have relatively small income gaps. Trust is critical. Without trust, we can't do anything, as you all know. Trust is very hard to build and very easy to lose. Trust matters between communities, but also between communities and state institutions. And again, back to belonging. Belonging isn't only a job, and it's not a railway. It is also a job. It's also a railway so you can get to work, but it's also feeling at home. It's that journey from building a strong state to making Israel a place for us all, a home for all citizens of Israel, a warm home. And without going into it now, a sense of also common good. That's very difficult in divided societies because what makes one tribe happy makes another tribe dismayed. So it's really, really hard to create a sense of shared civic purpose. The work that I've done is all around the idea of fairness and the importance of fairness as a basis, a very profound human basis understood by everybody of how we can move forward together. Some of the things that are happening in Israel over the past 18 months, for one thing you might know is happening in Israel, you might be aware of, is COVID. But one could learn a lot about Israeli society by looking at how Israel addressed COVID. And one of the ways we addressed it, and still do to an extent, was as a competition between which tribe is doing better, which tribe is doing worse, who's letting us down, who's behaving badly, who's behaving better. And addressing a pandemic is not like a race. It's not a competition. You're either in it together or you're not in it together. And this is something, of course, that not only Israel, but we're all struggling with. in different ways. But it's revealed really, it's laid bare the kind of topography of social cohesion and trust in Israel. And there will also be positives. We've seen the army working in ultra-Orthodox communities and in Arab communities in ways that are really, really promising. So we've seen lots of positives, but we also saw the threads connecting different pieces of society and different communities to the state laid bare. The May conflict really showed us, I believe, two things. One is that the conflict can't be set aside because the conflict won't stay outside of Israel. The conflict is going to come into Israel because 20% of Israel's citizens are Arabs, and their families are in Gaza and the West Bank. And although they're absolutely determined to be first-class citizens and overwhelmingly law-abiding citizens, their state is at war with their people, and that's a very, very tough place to be. I think they've done it admirably for 75 years, but it can't go on forever. The second thing that the conflict, the fighting in May revealed is the enormous progress. And I wrote about this. Hopefully, if anyone wants to look at the piece and the blog at the Times of Israel, the progress that has been made on Jewish-Arab relations. It was incredible to compare what happened in May to what happened in the outbreak of the Second Intifada 21 years ago. Jewish and Arab citizens of Israel overwhelmingly stood up now, and they said, whether it's in industry, in business, in medicine, wherever it is, we are going to get through this together. And it was quite incredible to see messages coming out of places that were 20 years ago completely unimaginable. You've got the chairman of the Bank Leumi, Israel's largest bank, Dr. Haj Yihye, an Arab citizen from the Arab town of Taipei, sitting next to the CEO, saying together that Israel's largest bank is not going to let this divide its staff or change the way it does business. You had the medical, you had the whole of the healthcare system, and of course Israel's Arab citizens are overrepresented as doctors and nurses and across the healthcare fields. Absolutely clear that Israel, there's no way forward without Jewish-Arab partnership. So it was really a much healthier response than I feared initially, and I think some of those who take encouragement from a deterioration in relations between Jewish-Arab and Israel's Jewish and Arab citizens were left extremely disappointed. The new government, I think the new government is really interesting. I mean, this was unimaginable. You've got an Islamic party, you've got a settler leader, prime minister, a former head of the settlement movement. So you've got this extraordinary coalition, and the language in this coalition is what I would call the first, really a first sign of grown-up politics. We're not going to get it all. It's not my way or the highway. We're going to set some stuff aside. None of us is going to get everything we want, and we're going to move along. There's been a significant change in public discourse here, and my position is that you know, the more we can get away from binary politics, the more we can get away from them against us, the more complex the fabric it is, the more the complex the fabric is, the better we are. So I think it's really promising. The fabric is nowhere strong enough for us to be able to talk about the most difficult issues, This government is not going to be able to address borders or the conflict because there's not enough trust and there's not enough common purpose. But this is, to my mind, and not only to my mind, a very, very important and encouraging development. 4 insights going forward, and then I'm going to, we'll go to questions. Citizenship matters. One of the surprises of Israel, although I think there are some reasons, is that after the enormous achievement of establishing the national homeland of the Jewish people with enormous sacrifice and ingenuity, Israel has never really taken citizenship seriously. One of the reasons, I think, is the fear that if we take citizenship seriously, somehow Israel will be disconnected from world Jewry, something that I don't believe to be true. But we have to take citizenship seriously. Citizenship matters. We have to address the conflict. We can't just pretend it's not there. It's both a moral and strategic imperative. Let's all grow up already. We have to go beyond the quite childish way I certainly grew up thinking about Israel, and we all did. And it's going to be perfect. And if it's not perfect, it's awful. Those 2 camps of those who cheer Israel, whatever we do, and those who condemn Israel, whatever it does, to my mind, they're both equally unhelpful. Israel is a state, a very special state. It's on a journey. It's a work in progress. And as you look around the world, there's not many states where I immediately say, wow, better than expected, less than required. And I do actually think it's useful when looking in on Israel from around the world to think about, well, can I say that about wherever it is I live? The United States, Canada, Australia, the UK. Are we doing better than expected, given our histories, resources, opportunities, geopolitics, and so forth? So we really have to grow up. There's wonderful things that happen in Israel. There's horrible things that happen. There's fabulous people. There's horrible people. Overall, I think that there's so much to be proud of, but we really need to have the confidence now to take that grown-up approach. I think it's high time. We're strong enough, we're successful enough, we can really now grow up. The last just takeaway, and I mentioned this, is because it's so important when talking about Israel, and I'm pleased if there's one takeaway from this, when talking about Israel and Israelis, let's make sure we're talking about all Israelis. Let's make sure that our language helps strengthen the fabric of Israeli society, and that inadvertently we're not excluding different groups of Israeli because we're talking about Israelis and Ethiopians. Well, Ethiopians are Israeli citizens, or Israelis and Arabs. Well, 2 million human beings are Arab Israeli citizens. So we just have to take language very seriously, understand that it shapes awareness and it shapes reality. And we've had an incredible journey. 74 years ago, I think many people would have said it would be crazily optimistic that we are where we are now with the achievements that Israel has. And the journey is going to continue. And there's an incredible generation of young Israelis of all backgrounds who are doing the most outstanding committed work to knitting the fabric and making sure that Israel will be stronger and better than ever. It's going to be bumpy. It's going to be challenging, that it can be an absolute fantastic journey, and that is what I'm certain lies ahead. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mike. That was everything that I personally expected. A frank discussion, a frank analysis of Israel, a very honest one. And none of us who have a vested interest in the country, whether it be because we have family there, or whether it just be from a feeling of Zionism and the belief that Israel is indeed the homeland of the Jewish people, we must never shy away from discussing the issues. And like some of you have commented in here, that Israel is a country like any other. In many ways, you could argue that it's a country unlike others, because it's very young. It's a miracle. It's grown from a socialist country to a leading economy. There's lots to be proud of, and as Mike said, there's a journey ahead. It's a work in progress, and please God, as time goes by, it will indeed become a truly a comfortable home for all of its citizens. So Mike, thank you for that. I'm going to put some questions to you now, as we've had a few have come through on the chat. Just noting how one of the issues one of the points you ended off your presentation this evening with was about language. You did touch on the nation-state law, and perhaps you can answer or explain for the benefit of myself and everyone here this evening. In the nation-state law, what happened to the language, to the Arabic language? Was it downgraded from an official language? Was it something that was just lost in the uproar over the nation-state law?
Thank you. Well, first of all, I just say about the nation-state law, and I wrote about this. I feel that the nation-state law was anti-Jewish and anti-Zionist, primarily anti-Zionist. It really set back the argument that as national homeland of the Jewish people, Israel can be and must be fair to all of its citizens. So I just felt it was an unnecessary political slap in the face, also to me as a Jewish Zionist Israeli. And I can absolutely say that I had conversations with friends and colleagues, dear friends and colleagues who I've worked with for 20 years, Arab citizens of Israel, in tears, saying to me, Mike, what else do I have to do? What else do I have to do? And people who just felt, awful. What happened in terms of language is that Arab language was downgraded. I can't remember in Hebrew or in English the precise language, but it went from an equal language to an official language. And then there was talk that this would actually have no impact because it was only symbolic. So of course I said, well, if it's symbolic, then why do it? But I think it has had some impact. For example, there was, and I don't want to hear, I want to be careful, that I heard that there was possibly going to be some change in the availability of translation for Arab citizens in the court system, and so there were implications. What I can tell you though is that law or no law, the place of Arabic in Israel has become more and more prominent and more accepted. Buses and trains, you see where they're going in Arabic, wherever they are. Walk around a university here. When I was in Tel Aviv University, you never heard Arabic. Now you walk around a university, you hear Arabic. People not ashamed to speak in Arabic and not fearful to speak in Arabic. There are so many Jewish Israelis learning Arabic that, it's just, there's more and more Jewish Israelis want to learn Arabic. And I can also tell you that there's more and more Jewish Israelis who will talk about them, for example, themselves as Jewish Arabs, saying that, you know, I came from North Africa. I grew up, you know, with hearing my parents speak, you know, Moroccan Arabic or you know, for an Egyptian dialect or whatever it was. That's part of me.
Yeah.
And so you've got Jewish Israelis from Arab countries, you know, reclaiming Arab. And when you see now, for example, diplomatic relations, the warming of relations, for example, with Morocco, you're going to see incredible things happening. So that law was a completely, you know, redundant blow. But I think the people are speaking louder than the legislators.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's very good to hear, that the reality is that rather than a suppression of the language and the freedom to speak it. Someone noted at the beginning, when you were at the very beginning of your presentation, that you didn't mention specifically the Bedouin communities, and that, you know, they noted that there are many in the Negev, there's many in the Galil, and they serve, you know, they actively serve in the army. And the person who asked, who made the observation, mentioned Ismail Khaldi, who was actually served as a diplomat here in the UK for the Israeli embassy.
Yeah.
Maybe you could just embellish a little bit about the Bedouin community.
Absolutely. So thank you. So you know, there are different ways, of course, of dividing up human beings. Some Arab citizens of Israel said they don't want these divisions, you know, between Arab, Palestinian Muslims and Druze and Bedouin and Christians, and they see it as a mechanism for dividing communities. Some communities see it differently. In the south, there are about, I believe, 300,000 Bedouin citizens of Israel, Sunni Muslims. There are also Bedouin in the north. There are also Bedouin communities that have been displaced. For example, after the peace agreement with Egypt, when Israel built the air bases, Bedouin were displaced and moved to Lod, which has caused a great deal of social disruption for them and in general. Bedouin are obviously, you know, the particular lifestyle, nomadic, historically. Right now, some of them are in towns like Rahat and other towns in the south. There are about 50 unrecognized communities in the south where the conditions are very, very bleak. And as a Jewish Israeli, I say, and as an Israeli, you know, absolutely not good enough. There's no reason in 2021 that there are Israelis living off the grid that don't want to live off the grid. And there's a huge amount of work to be done. But there's also progress there. I have a very good friend, a remarkable man from one of those Bedouin towns, Ibrahim Nassaspa from Lakia. He's 40 years old. He always talks about learning responsibility by shepherding the family's sheep. He now has 2 extremely large businesses. He's a very generous philanthropist. He's also actually donated to Mir Khabib and to my book, the Arabic version, Arabic translation of my book. He has himself set up an NGO which is helping hundreds of young Bedouin high school students get into Israeli universities, get into universities, into science and engineering. So there's the gaps are very, very wide, and that absolutely has to be addressed. Some Bedouin, of course, do go to the army, some don't. It's also a divisive issue within the Bedouin community.
Yeah, sure.
I would just say, in terms of Bedouin being no, I think we should go on. Let's have more questions. That's me pondering.
Right. Okay. To what extent do you feel national military service is a catalyst for social cohesion?
Well, firstly, thank you for that question. It's a very important question. The reality is, and this is not a new reality, that somewhat less than 50% of Israeli 18-year-olds go into the military. And they are primarily from two of the four tribes that I mentioned, the Jewish secular and the Jewish national religious. So the Israeli army is not a melting box, a melting pot, excuse me. The Israeli army is not a place where all young Israelis come together. It's a place where, to an extent, 50% of Israelis come together. There are encouraging signs, again, of national service programs and of civic service programs, civil service programs. And that's where we see that when one starts to be sensible and grown up and says to Arab citizens of Israel who want to serve their communities and they want something to do between school and university, and they don't want to be employed at the very high levels they are right now. When one says to them, do civic service, and that civic service might be organized by the welfare ministry, rather than do national service with the Ministry of Defense organizing it, then that pragmatism allows young Arab citizens to play a role as they want to do, strengthening their communities.
Great.
The Arab citizens of Israel overwhelmingly are not going to serve in the military while the conflict between their state and their people continues. And it's a complete red herring, by the way, because no Jewish Israelis actually want Arab citizens of Israel having more guns. At the moment, they've got too many guns, as Arab citizens of Israel themselves agree. And of course, the crime issue is an issue that is an extremely painful issue that I don't think we'll have time to cover. And the ultra-Orthodox community is also not going to, in very large numbers, join the military. So the Israeli military, again, it's a myth. No, all Israelis never went, and they still don't.
Okay, Mike, thanks for that. Yeah, you mentioned about sustainable relations, and you mentioned trust. Someone here has observed that sustainable relations and trust aren't helped by aggressive settlers attacking Palestinians whilst law enforcers stand by and often do nothing. The person who's put this forward says that as a Jew, I fear for Israel's peace. You know, we do hear we hear far more than we'd like to about you know, Israelis, settlers, whatever terminology you want to use, perpetrating attacks against Palestinians. Obviously, you know, we know full well that the opposite happens as well. But what, you know, can you offer anything on that? What's being done to quash these attacks by settlers, by Israelis living across the Green Line against the Palestinians?
Well, the first thing I can say that I completely agree. It's completely shameful. It's disgraceful. And states, you know, I talked about kind of, you know, the fundamentals of a modern state. One is agreed borders, and one is a monopoly of armed force by the state. And as soon as you've got militias running around, you're in a very sorry state. Now, this has gone on for a very long time, and there has certainly been far too high a level, in my opinion, of the state turning a blind eye, or the state even in some areas working hand in hand. If one looks at now the worst of the settler violence is in Area C in the West Bank. Area C is 60% of the West Bank. It's where the large settlement blocks are. And it's where, once again, the poorest of the poor Palestinians are 150,000 Palestinians who are generally Bedouin, living in very, very poor conditions. In fact, I just came back from a visit there 2 or 3 weeks ago, and it's unacceptable. It's completely unacceptable. The attacks on those Bedouins is an attempt, to I believe, to push them out of Area C into areas A and B, which are controlled either entirely by the Palestinian Authority in the case of Area A, or civilly by the Palestinian Authority in the case of Area B, and militarily by Israel. There's no excuse for this, and every time it happens, it's shameful, and every time it happens, it makes your lives harder, and it has to stop.
Yeah. I mean, are there, we get news filtering through from all sorts of sources, but is there anything, is it being addressed by the current government? Is there any sign of it being addressed more actively?
I think the Defense Minister, Benny Gantz, shows signs of wanting to address it. As soon as there's a Arab party in the coalition, and Meretz and the Labour Party in the coalition, then there's a better environment for addressing the issue. It's a very, very hard, and you can hear me sitting here struggling. It's a very, very hard issue to understand, and it also takes us in some areas to the fact that this is a struggle with messianic aspects to it, with fundamentalism on all sides. The only thing I would say is that we cannot, the great majority has must not let extremists continue to dominate the shape of Israel's future. The weight that extremists have wielded on Israel's future, of course, not starting with, but with the assassination of Prime Minister Rabin by a fanatical, hate-filled Jewish Israeli, that has written the trajectory of all of our lives on this call, and so we really have to. The 90%, and I really do believe that 90% of everybody, all Israelis and Palestinians and everybody of all backgrounds, want reasonable, what I would call grown-up shared futures. And we're going to have to, step up and, and make sure that our voice is what shapes the future.
Here. I don't think there's any other way. Mike, I'm going to put one final question to you. As time is getting on. It's more an observation, but I'm sure that you'll be able to comment on it. It's an observation that people are still living in their national groups in Israel. Arabs living, in their own areas. Israeli Jews, Arabs and Israeli Jews don't live in some areas, and they often don't mix socially. And how many speak each other's language? So maybe you can address that and make some observations.
Well, I mean, I think first of all, it's important. Israel was founded in a bloody conflict, which was traumatic for everyone. Then the different groups moved in, as I said. So Israelis, Jewish and Arab, secular and religious, have historically lived separately. But what is absolutely clear is And it's extremely challenging. It's all the more challenging if you don't have what I call a mature democratic culture of being comfortable with diversity and accommodating difference and living with disagreements. But Israelis are in ever closer proximity, learning more about each other in the workplace, in communities that just because there are 9 million citizens now living in an extremely small space, you know, in much closer proximity and traveling together on trains and together in universities and in hospitals, of course, and everywhere else. So that is kind of happening. The question is, of course, you know, how smooth will it be, and how successful will it be, and how enriching will it be, or how divisive and difficult it will be. What I will say is that I think it's going disturbingly well for those for whom the idea of different groups living together decently in Israel is is foreign. Those, you know, and the work that I do. I mean, you know, Steve, you know, yeah, on the previous call, talked about the work of integrating 1,000 Arab Israeli teachers in Jewish Israeli schools as math, English, and science teachers, and that becoming normalized. The program that I lead at the Ted Harrison Family Foundation with Merchavim now, of Israelis of all backgrounds coming together, thinking about how their organizations can be more open and inclusive and diverse, and what they can do to contribute to thickening the social fabric. I mean, I think that overwhelmingly, it's now understood that at the end of the day, like every other state, Israel can't be stronger than its social fabric. A state cannot, over time, be stronger than the social fabric from which it's woven. And I think even though the politics is still often obnoxious, that Israelis have kind of got it. And when you go into a shopping mall, or into a hospital, or into a business, or wherever it is, you know, the landscape is changing. And we have to do everything we can to encourage that. Yeah. And that's what not only I, but many tens and hundreds of thousands of Israelis of goodwill of all backgrounds are doing. And I don't think we're about to be stopped.
Great to hear. Great to hear. Well, you know, it's as expected. It's been very, very insightful. Very and leaving. You know, I'm left with a big sense of hope. Very much a glass half full. As you've said, it's a journey. Israel is 74 years young. There's much to be done. There's much progress to be made. But, you know, like you said, when you consider its accomplishments, it's doing very well. But, you know, in terms of its society and building that cohesion, a lot more to be done. And it's thanks to the likes of people like you, and, you know, the organization of Merchavim that you founded, and the Ted Harrison Foundation, you know, amongst others, that are doing this work to build on Israel's society, and that's fantastic. And we hope that we can do more with you in the future. So, on behalf of me and the ZF and the WZO here in the UK, thank you to everyone. Thank you to you, Mike, for an outstanding presentation. And thank you to everyone for joining us. Be safe, be well, and please God, we'll meet online soon. Okay, thanks everyone. Good night. Thanks, Mike. Bye-bye.